Hello and welcome to Game & Chat, the podcast where we invite members of the gaming community and industry to join us to play some of their favourite multiplayer games whilst telling us about themselves and why they like these games so much. I'm your host Mike, and instead of actually doing the show myself this time around, I am passing it over to Jack because he recently had the opportunity to interview a Mr. Toshihiro Kondo, who is the president of Nihon Falcom, in person at a press event in London. So rather than me ramble on and, take the, all the limelight and the spotlight, I'm actually going to pass it over to Jack. So Jack, over to you.
Since we like to start every interview with a brief introduction, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself to our viewers and tell us a bit about yourself and your role at Nihon Falcom?
自己紹介をお願いしたいんですけれども、基本的に社長が、ファルコムさんで何の役割を果たしていることを含めて自己紹介。
はい。代表取締役社長なので、当然その経営関係も一通り出てますし、それから、もともとはゲーム開発出身なので、ディレクションやる場合もあれば、プロデューサーやる場合もありますし、それからやっぱり、イフシリーズに関して言えば、まだまだシナリオライターとして、メインを張っているという感じですね。はい。
So I'm Toshihiro Kondo. I am well, we'd say in American English, the president of Nihon Falcom, which, is an executive role. So he says I'm in charge of the company's finances and overall direction. But within that, I am also originally part of game development. And I actually still take part in game development. For example, I work as the producer of the Trail series, as well as I am the writer and the director of the East series as well.
Lovely, thank you very much. Since becoming the president, you and your team have accomplished much in the last 14 years. Is there anything you've achieved in that time that you consider one of your greatest achievements?
社長が確か、14年前に社長座に入ったと思うんですが、近藤さんが社長としてこの14年間の中で、自分の中で一番、これよくできたなとか、これすごく達成感のあるプロジェクトとかありましたでしょうか？
どれも一つ一つ大事な、ミッションだったので、これがあって、すぐパッと出てこないんですけれど、ただやっぱり僕が社長になる前は、日本ファルコムでずっと PC でゲームを出してきて、で、一番最初の大きな仕事ってその PC のやっぱりパッケージがどんどん市場からシュリンクして売れなくなってきた時だったんですね。日本ファルコムって言ったら誰もが知る PC ゲームの U って言われていまして、それを大きく変えてコンソールに移行していかないとちょっと会社がなかなか継続できないんじゃないかっていうところがいきなりミッションとしてあったんですよ、社長になった年に。はい、それをやっぱり達成したっていうのが今も多分一番大きな思い出と思ってますね。
So honestly speaking, in terms of going title by title, each title that I've worked on and that's been worked on under my direction over the last 14 years, I'm proud of, and I can't single out anything in particular. But what I can say is that 14 years ago, since becoming president, he says the Japanese market was in a very difficult position, particularly in terms of PC games, which they were predominantly a PC game developer. And so he says, from becoming the president, I immediately had a mission, which was to kind of transition the company from being a PC predominantly focused game developer to one that switched more to consoles as well. He says, so I suppose you could say I'm most proud of taking on that mission and being able to successfully navigate the company from going from a PC developer to a console developer.
Lovely stuff. Having first started as a fan of The Legend of Heroes 3 White Witch and creating the fan site The Saga of Tiraswell in 1996 to joining Falcom in 98, you've become heavily involved and your career makes an inspiring tale. What was it about The Legend of Heroes 3 that inspired you so much?
社長は、まずは、ファルコムさんのファンとして、確か、白き魔女の大好きっていうタイトルがあって大好きということで、1996年にファンサイトを立ち上げて、なんと、1998年に、ファルコムさんに入社されたと思うんですけど、それは非常に、インスピレーションの高いストーリーだと思うんですが、なぜ、特に白き魔女というゲームをどこの魅力を感じて、そんなに
そうですね。白き魔女って、ものすごくストーリーが充実したゲームだったんですね。で、とにかく、ものすごいテキストの量が多いんです。で、普通テキストの量が多いと嫌じゃないですか。読むのめんどくさいし。でもその一つ一つのこのキャラクターの発言が魅力的だし、その全体のストーリーが、白き魔女と呼ばれる謎の人物の、この足跡をずっと追っていくような、すごく綺麗なストーリーなんですね。で、彼女が一体どうなったんだろうっていうところで、その、彼女を追っていく旅がですね、すごく魅力的に描かれていて、で、最後の最後に待つ結末が本当に物悲しくて綺麗な結末なんですよ。で、本当にそこに心を打たれて、こんなストーリーの RPG があるんだっていうインスピレーションを受けたのが、そもそもファルコムに入社しようと思って最初のきっかけかもしれないです。はい。
So the thing about The White Witch is that it's got such a detailed story. He said the game has an incredibly huge amount of text. And he said, normally speaking, when you think of a game that has a lot of text, it's like, God, that's a lot of reading. I don't really want to do it. But he says the text was so well written, the characters were so well portrayed, and the things that they said were so interesting, he couldn't help but be enthralled by it. He said the story follows the titular White Witch, and essentially the characters are following in her footsteps and kind of searching after her. And so following that adventure and seeing where they go, until finally you reach the climax and the end of the story and how it all resolves, he says it's just so amazing to him. And he thought, wow, an RPG story can be something like this. And he said it was so inspirational that he said this was something that kind of changed how he looked at RPGs. And he said that's probably what caused him to want to actually join the company and why he decided to apply and enter Falcom.
奇跡シリーズっていうのは本当にもろにその白き魔女のインスピレーションを受けて立ち上げたタイトルです。
And he says the Trail series itself is actually, it's directly because of the White Witch that they were able to start and create and then maintain and continue this series.
And moving from one Legends of Heroes game, we jump straight to another. With Trails Through Daybreak 2 releasing in the West next year, what can you tell us about this sequel in terms of gameplay and story?
黒の奇跡2が、欧米で来年の早々に発売となると思うんですけれども、簡単に、ストーリーとゲームプレイの紹介いただけませんか？
そうですね。もともと黒の奇跡1というゲームがあって、その続編にはなるんですけれど、奇跡シリーズの中には結構大きな国がエレゴニア帝国と、それからカルバード教の大きな国があって、天の奇跡では、帝国を描いて、で、今は黒の奇跡ではもう共和国という場所を舞台にお話が進んでいくことになります。
So, talking about the story, obviously this takes place after the events of Trails Through Daybreak 1. And Trails Through Daybreak 1 is in contrast to what came before in the Cold Steel series. So the Cold Steel series of games focused on a place called the Erebonian Empire, whereas Trails Through Daybreak takes place in the Republic of Calvert. And so that's one of the big differences that you'll see, and you'll be able to see throughout the course of the Daybreak games just what kind of country this Republic of Calvert actually is, and this is what these games explore.
で、このカルバード共和国がどういう場所かというと、ちょっとなるべく端的にお話しすると、非常に複雑な社会情勢の国で、今までのその帝国が貴族中心の社会だったりとか、リベル王国は女王様がいてしっかり統治されているのに対して、本当にいろんな勢力がいる闇社会の人間であるとか、それから移民によるいろんな人種が複雑に絡み合った社会で、その中で、裏稼業的なスプリガンという職業を営む、バンアクライトという主人公が活躍していくお話になります。
So, what is this country of Calvert, you might ask? Well, Calvert is a very complex country. It's got a very complex society because not only do you have a different form of government. For example, in the Erebonian Empire, it was obviously a class-based system with nobility.
Yeah.
In the liberal games, you had a queen, and so you had a kingdom situation. In contrast to that, the Republic of Calvert is very different. It's got all these different groups that are kind of vying for control of different areas and different things. And within that, you also have a huge immigrant population in this country as well, which creates a really complex society. And because it does have this kind of seedy underbelly to it, there is within it a character named Van Arkwright, who's the main character of this story. And he works in this underbelly, and it's his job. He's called a Spriggan, and his job is to kind of solve these problems that other groups, more maybe lawful groups, don't necessarily take. So that, in a nutshell, is what the country of Calvert is and who our main character is for these games.
As previously stated, the Trials series is nearing its end, as the series is around 90% complete in terms of story, having maintained a continuous story across multiple decades with many different characters. What are some of the hardest difficulties you've had to face when it came to maintaining the lore?
このシリーズは10年単位で続いていまして、で多分大変難しいことがあったんでしょうか。その中で一番難しいところはやっぱりシリーズを続くことは何でしょうか。
シリーズが続けられる秘訣みたいなそうですかね。
より続けることにあたって難しいこと、例えばやっぱり辻褄が合うようなことで
そうですね。なんだろうな、いろんな難しいことって見方があるんですけれど、一つはやっぱりすごく膨大なシナリオをやっぱり管理しないといけないので、やっぱりそこはやっぱりスタッフに情熱が求められるところではあるんですよね。で、やっぱりそのスタッフのモチベーションをやっぱりネタ持つっていうのも大事で、やっぱりそこに対してチームのリーダーとしてはやっぱりそういったことに気を使っていかないといけないし、もっともっと技術的なところではゲームとしてもやっぱり長年続くとトレンドが変わっていくので、どこまでトラディショナルにやって、どこから新しいものをどんどん取り入れていくのかとか、そういうところも難しいとは思います。
So there's plenty of difficult things about managing and running a story over multiple years. One being, of course, is managing the story itself, making sure everything lines up, because the games do tell a continuously related story. Another thing is maintaining staff morale. Because the staff has to work on these for so long, he says it's very important as a leader to make sure that the staff is fulfilled in their work. And so making sure that the staff is adequately managed and that they keep that level of enthusiasm and love up for the stories that they're working on. And finally, because the series has been going on for so long, trends change within the gaming industry and within storytelling and things like that. So it's important to know when to keep things more orthodox and more traditional within it, and when to kind of incorporate new things and new elements that are popular at the time. So all these things are kind of difficult things to manage over the course of a long-running series such as the Trail series.
With the end of Trials in sight and Nihon Falcom already looking to the future with many other projects in the works, including new IPs, if you had to put a number on it, how many more Trials games do you think there will be before the final installment comes knocking?
奇跡シリーズはほぼクライマックスに立ったと以前社長がおっしゃっていて、もしこれから奇跡タイトルはいくつかのゲームが出るだと思うんですけれども、具体的に何個は出ると決定はしてますでしょう
具体的にあと何タイトルっていうのは決めてないんですよね。これまでも決めてるけれど結局結構変更が入って例えば千の奇跡なんて本当は2作で終わる予定だったのに4作続いて、ここで僕があと何作ですって言って多分全く信用が得られないとただ今日本で発売した貝の奇跡があって、でそれもやっぱり共和国を描いてはいるんですけれど、これ共和国を描くアークが終わったところで残っているところってもう一つぐらいのアークかなっていうふうに思ってるんですね。で、それがちょっと何作になるかっていうのは今ここでは断言できないんですけれど、やっぱりそこをラストに持っていけるように今スタッフの中で話し合ってるところです。
Says, honestly, I can't say how many games there will be. And part of the reason for that is that in the past we had said, there's going to be X amount of games that we'll do for whatever, and we haven't been able to keep to that. A great example would be the Cold Steel games. He said, obviously, that ended up being 4 games, but originally it was only supposed to be 2. So I'm not going to come here and say specifically the series will finish in this amount of games. What I will say is that right now we're in the Calvert arc of the series, and so far we've got Daybreak 1 and 2, and then we have a game that just came out in Japan called Kai no Kiseki, which is also part of this arc. So what I will say is that once this arc ends, the Calvert arc ends, we do want to make the next arc the final arc.
Yep.
I can't say how many titles will be in this final arc, but we have talked amongst ourselves and the staff and said, okay, this is going to be it. So the series should conclude in the next arc.
That's fair enough. Has there ever been an idea or a scenario that you wanted to do in a Trials game that you were unable to incorporate but made work in another title?
奇跡シリーズでちょっとやりたかったことがあって、
Welcome to London.
奇跡シリーズでちょっとやりたかったことがあって、奇跡シリーズで実現できなかったんですけれども、別のシリーズかタイトルで実現できたことはありますでしょうか？
それは奇跡シリーズ以外のタイトルでっていうことですか？
まあ、もともと奇跡シリーズでこれちょっとやってみたいなというところがあって、何らかの理由で、奇跡でできなかったんですけど、別のシリーズでこれは当てはまるとか、ライトシリーズ、それで採用したことがありますでしょうか？例えばストーリーの部分でも、ゲームプレイの部分は、奇跡でちょっとやってみようとしたんですけど、やっぱり合わないんで、でも別のところは使えたと。
ちょっとその質問に的確に答えたことになるかわかんないですけれど、東京ザナドゥっていうタイトルは、もともと奇跡の派生から生まれたタイトルなんですね。で、全の奇跡を作った時に、やっぱりフィールドアクションをどこまでやるかって結構議論になったんですよ。あんまりそのアクションに寄せると奇跡シリーズじゃなくなる。ターンベースがやっぱり奇跡の基本。でも、ここまで作ったからにアクションゲームできそうだよねっていうところから始まって、で、その時に、ただ、スタッフの中で、ずっとやっぱり僕らファンタジーものばかり作ってたから、現代ものがやりたいっていう衝動がやって、その奇跡でやっぱりそのアクションに振り切れなかったところと、現代ものがやりたいっていう衝動が重なって、東京ザナドゥっていう、ちょっと、別のタイトルが生まれたことがあります。
This might be a little off from what you're asking, but one example that I can give you is the Tokyo Xanadu game. So originally, this is kind of a game that you could say almost was derived from the Cold Steel games. When we were making the Cold Steel games, he says that there was what's called field actions. And He says we were trying to figure out the best way to use these field actions within the game. However, one issue that we encountered was that if we made them too detailed, it ended up kind of losing the turn-based aspect that we were going for from a combat perspective. And so he said, no, in the midst of creating this, we could almost have this be its own game, which suddenly turned into, actually, this totally could be its own game. And so he says, we decided to make Tokyo Xanadu its own thing. However, he says, when I approached the staff with this, they said, look, if we're going to make another game, please let's not do fantasy. Let's make it set in the modern world. So he said these two things came together, this fact that we have a system in place here which we could turn into its own thing, and this desire of the staff to want to make a game that was set in modern times. And so these came together to form what became Tokyo Xanadu.
That's fair enough. And last main Trials question we've got. In your opinion, what are the main attributes that every Trials game needs in order to be a Trials game?
最後の奇跡シリーズに関する質問ですけども、奇跡シリーズというのは、こういう要素があってならないとは何でしょうか？
あってはダメなも
ごめんなさい。
の。あったら、これがある。
なってはならないと。
なくてはならない。
そうです。はい。ちょっと、ごめんなさい。こういうものイコール、奇跡シリーズというものですね。
白き魔女がやっぱりそうだったんですけれど、もともとこの英雄伝説シリーズって、ゲームがどんどん当時進化していって、ものすごいやっぱり綺麗なグラフィックだったりとか 3D とか移り変わっていく時期に、やっぱりでもそのグラフィックをこう良くしようとするとすごくお金がかかるし、人もたくさん必要だしっていう時代になってきてたんですね。で、その中で、日本ファルコンが勝負していく手段として、シナリオをきちんと、とにかくやろうよ。で、シナリオは、やっぱり逆に人がたくさんいたからっていいものになるわけじゃなくて、得意な人が一人いれば、いいものができる可能性があるから、それをとにかく一生懸命やって、それに合わせてゲームを形作っていこうよっていうコンセプトで始めたらしいですね。でイースは逆にアクションがあって、それにシナリオを浮かばせていくんですけど、奇跡はそういう経緯があって、とにかくストーリーを充実させるっていうところが、もう最大の な大きな目標としてこう、スタートを切るっていうところが毎回あるんですね。なので、やっぱりストーリーをきちんといいものにするっていうところが絶対に外せないと思います。
It says, well, this is actually originally derivative from the White Witch, which I talked about earlier, but story is of the utmost importance. He says, as the times changed and graphics became better and better, obviously there came a point when the conversation had to be had. It's like, well, do we decide to fight on the side of graphics and go for these absolutely gorgeous graphics? But there's various issues involved with that, many of them relating to money. And it's not necessarily true that even if you make a great graphically looking game, it's going to be a good game. So he said they thought carefully about, well, then what is an arena that we can fight in? And he said that arena would be the story. As the game changes, the story is very strong, and that's what keeps the player invested. That's what keeps the player wanting to play, is having a great story. And so he says for them, for the Trails series in particular, the story is always at the forefront. The story needs to be wonderful so that even if graphically it might not be, at the top, the story is what's going to drive people forward and keep them playing. He said, East, which is obviously the other big Falcom series, is different because, honestly speaking, the gameplay comes first, and the gameplay then informs what they want to do with the story. But for Trails, the story comes first, and the Trails is the most important thing. And he says every time they work on a new Trails title, they think carefully about how to make the story the best that it can be, and that's what makes Trails what it is that story.
That's a great answer. Being as though you've been involved as director, producer, and scenario writer, is it fair to assume you've returned as a scenario writer for Ys X Nordics?
イースシリーズの中では、もう一つはたくさん肩書きが出てきたんですけど、プロデューサー、シナリオライター、ディレクター。今回はイースティンでは、
そうですね。一つはやっぱりゲームの大きな根本部分を決めるのが一つの仕事でした。今回だから、イースって9まではずっとパーティーバトルで生きていて、で、やっぱりそれがある程度続いていたので、10はやっぱり大きな区切りになるので、もう旧来のユーザーにとってもやっぱり新鮮なものにしたいし、それから新規のユーザーさんがもっともっと入ってくれるようにしたらどうしたらいいのかというところから話を始めていって、で、大きくバトルの部分を見直したりとか、それから従来イスには全くなかったその船による探索であるとか、そのゲームの大きな方針とちょっとそこから細かく砕いた具体的なところのアイデアを出すっていうのを行っています。それと、やっぱりメインのシナリオが自分の大きな役割です。
Yes, so I essentially say I have two roles. The first is to come up with the basic concept and development of the game itself. One of the things about Ys 10 is that it is an important title, it being the 10th in the series, and it's a great opportunity to look at things and kind of start fresh. So we said one thing that we particularly looked at was the party system, which had come out in the previous few Ys games, to totally revamp that. And that's what kind of gave way, he says, to the system that you now see plays, which is very different within Ys 10. And so he says all of these things that relate to how the game plays, the combat system, how all of that is arranged is something that he directly led and worked on and gave direction for. In addition to that, he says he also was the main scenario writer of the game too.
What was the decision-making process that led to creating a Ys game with Norse inspirations, and what was your moment that made you went, we have something here?
なぜイーステンはバイキングがメインなテーマで、プロセスの中でバイキングテーマを多分いろいろ考えたんですけど、その時点でやっぱりこれいけるなっていう、なんだったんでしょうか。
そうですね。まだイースの舞台となっているエレシア大陸って、割とローマ時代のなんていうか勢力図をモチーフにしているので、ロモン帝国っていう、ローマをモチーフにした国が出てきて、彼らが大きく勢力を伸ばしている中で、アドルが冒険していくっていうことを描いているんですね。で、そうするとやっぱり常にやっぱりロモン帝国が敵として出てきて、インディ・ジョーンズにおけるちょっとドイツみたいなポジションで毎回展開されるので、ちょっと新しい展開がよろしい。で、北側はじゃあどうなっているのかっていうところは、実はまだ全然シリーズの9作目の間に触れられてなくて、で、ここにロモン帝国と拮抗するような勢力があると、新しい展開が期待できるんじゃないかな。じゃあ、どういうものがあるかなって 北って考えるとやっぱりもうまずバイキングが出てくるんですよね。で、ちょうど僕その頃はネットフリックスでバイキングのドラマに夢中になってたこともあって、これはいけるんじゃないかなと思いました。はい。
So he says, as you may be aware, the world of East is based on Europe, and it's in a place called Eritrea. It's on the Eritrean continent. And just like in the real world, there's various analogs to real world locations, real world powers.
Yeah.
One of them being the Roman Empire, which is obviously spelled R-O-M-U-N,
Yeah.
which is obviously based on the Roman Empire,
Yes.
our own real world history. And throughout the course of the East series so far, we've seen the Roman Empire extending its reach over various parts of this world. And just about up until now, up until East 9, every time something's happened within an East Games, it's turned out like, oh, the Roman Empire's been behind it. They're the bad guys. And so he says, well, taking a look at this world, what's going on? We've only really depicted the southern part that's controlled by the Roman Empire. What's going on in the northern part of this world? There has to be some kind of oppositional group to the Romans up there. So what are they? And he says, thinking about that, well, when you look at a map of our own world, when you look at the north, what do you think of? Well, you think of Vikings. And he says, at that time when he was kind of thinking about these things and going over them and thinking of, well, how can we portray the northern part of this world? He was also watching the Vikings Netflix series. And so the two kind of came together and he said, this will work.
No worries. With East games becoming more action-focused in recent years, what is one of the biggest challenges you've had in trying to keep this series going over 37 years and keeping it relevant?
イースシリーズはアクションゲームとして、30年以上の歴史があって、どうやって毎回ゲームを変わって、ユーザーさんが受け入れるようにしてるでしょうか。どうやって、その、シリーズの今までの続ける秘訣なんでしょうか。
イースシリーズを始めるときって必ず最初の手順は決まっていて、まずはやっぱりアクションを気持ちがいいものにする。で、ストーリーとか、なんていうのかな、背景とか関係なく、まずはそのアドルを気持ちよく動かしているだけで楽しい。で、普通の雑魚をずっと戦闘してるだけで夢中になっても気がついたら時間が経ってたぐらい夢中になってるアクションができれば、そこにいろんなものを乗せていくば、その大きくつまらないものにはなるってことは絶対ないので、まずはやっぱりその気持ちいいアクションをベースに作るっていうところをまず第一目標にしています。
So the most important and the first thing that we look at with an East game, and this starts for every single East game, is the action element. This is the most important element. This comes first, and everything that comes after that, whether it be the story or the setting or all of these things, those are subject to this action element. So what does this action element mean? Well, this means how fun it is to control Adult and to play. A lot of the joy of East is that it feels so good to control and fight that even if you're out there just kind of, killing normal, small, nobody enemies, it's so much fun and you get so involved in it and enthralled with it that when you glance at the clock, you realize that hours have passed. That's the kind of thing that we go for. And so, if this is fun and if we've accomplished this, then that means the player's not going to be bored when they're playing it. They're going to enjoy it. And so because this informs everything that makes an East game an East game, it makes it fun, and it means that it's been able to continue for as long as it has. This is the core of what makes East East.
僕が最初に上司にイースシリーズを教わった時に言ったのが、イースのバトルってエアパッキンを潰すのと一緒だよ。プチプチプチプチって。で、夢中になってずっと続けられるでしょう。教えられたことがあります。
He says, when I first started working on the East game, the person that I learned how to make East games from said, the feeling of an East game when you're playing it should be like you're popping like the air bubble wrappers. And he says that feeling of that you could do this for all day and you just love it and you get so into it is what we're going for when we have folks play East. And he says that stuck with me and that's what we try to replicate.
それができたら、あとはやっぱり、このイースのタイトルごとにどこを冒険するかっていうところでいろいろシチュエーションが変わっていくと思うんですね。イース10だったら、たくさん大小の島があって、そこを船で冒険しながらっていうのは過去のタイトルにはないもので、そのさっきのプチプチとその設定が重なるとイース10になるんです。
And he says from that, then we figure out the setting. What would be the most appropriate setting that we haven't done before for this East game? And so in this case, East 10, you've got these islands and you've got this place called the Obelia Gulf that you're able to explore on a ship and go from place to place. And so this action feeling of like popping air bubbles mixed with a brand new setting every time that's relevant and unique to it is kind of what makes East special. And in this case, for East 10, we have that, perfectly.
Obviously, as you touched on earlier on, one of the biggest changes is Nordics gets rid of the party gameplay in favour of the cross-action one.
Yes.
Having played it myself, it gives you guys more chance to enrich the story, character development, animations. What other benefits has this new shift of change have you noticed during development that makes Nordic stand out?
先ほどの中で、イース10はパーティーシステムをして、今回は2人の都市人口になってるんですね。彼が先ほどちょっとあちらでプレイしたんですけれども、自分の気づくところは、ストーリーがもっと面白くなってると。で、アニメーションが綺麗になってると。で、ゲームプレイも変わって楽しく、新しい味もイースになってるんです。で、開発側としてやっぱり、これはイース10ならではできたことは、二人きりにすることは何だったでしょ
う。イース10って結構やっぱり10作目で大きな区切りになるんで、ガラッと変えたいっていう気持ちが、スタッフも僕もあったんですね。で、じゃあどうやって変えていこうかなって、イースのこれまでの課題をいろいろ考えてみると、よくこれはイースに限らずファルコンのゲーム言われるのがグラフィックが弱い。で、一方でやっぱりイースシリーズって、最近はずっと6人パーティーキャラクターがいて3人のパーティーを組ませるっていうルールでずっと来ていて。で、ただ自分たちでプレイしていても、ユーザーのプレイの仕方を見ていても、3人ぐらいは一生懸命育てるけど、4、5、6人目はちょっとおざなりになって、あまり使わないと。だったら、そういう、なかなかね、遊んでもらえないところは、遊んでもらえるところにギュッと圧縮して、で、グラフィックが弱いって言われるんだったら、その2人に絞って、とにかくそこにクオリティを上げるっていうところにつぎ込めないか。で、2人に絞った分、なんで2人なのかって、やっぱり分かりやすい、説明が必要だと思うんですね。はい、なので、シナリオでやっぱりそこを、だから2人なんだよってこなしてあげたり。今やっぱグラフィックに綺麗なところ見たら、2人に絞ってこんなに良くなったんだっていうところが伝わると思うんですね。そういうところ、いろんな考えがあって、ああいう形にどんどん集約していったという形になります。
はい。This is more directly to the why of why it became the two-party system versus kind of what you were asking originally. But the idea was that when taking a look at starting East 10, it was, well, what are some of the issues that we've encountered up until now? And so one of those things that they were often told is that the graphics weren't necessarily always the best for their games. And they said, okay, so well then how can we combat that? And one of the areas that they looked to was the party system, which had been implemented over the past few games. Because, as you would expect, having a 6-person party, a lot of time and resources need to be put into specifically doing all of this. So they said, well, if we were able to pare this down to only 2 characters, that would mean that we could then focus on making the graphics better, which he says, hopefully, that you noticed when you played East 10. You'll see that the graphics have been improved. And he says, however, just by doing that, there still has to be a reason that you only have 2 playable characters. And so he said there has to be a story reason that there's only 2 characters. And so they worked hard to make sure that the 2 characters that you are able to play as, there's this very specific story reason for that makes sense, where the party system is no longer implemented. And so because both of those things were because they were able to have only 2 main characters, which was then able to allow them to kind of improve the graphics and everything around the graphics, that allows East 10 to stand out and to be different. And he says, when they were thinking about this, they approached this from various angles to make sure that they were doing what would be best for the title. And so the end result was East 10, and they feel that they accomplished that goal.
逆にその後はシナリオに関して言うとしたら、アドルとカージャに絞ったことで、やっぱりアドルとカージャの関係性であるとか、それからカージャ自身に対して、いつものパーティーキャラに割いているリソースを彼らのやっぱり描写に避けるので、これはやっぱりそのイースのいろんなシリーズの中でもちょっとオリジナリティのあるものになると思います。そういったいろんな問題をいっぺんに解決するのが、アドルとカージャの2人コンビっていうことだったっていうことだと思います。
And also within that too is just all of the resources that would have, as we mentioned earlier, going into making all the other characters were able to be put into Adel and Karja. And this goes beyond, obviously there's a story element, which depicting their relationship, they're able to do so much more because it's just the 2 of them. But there's also all of those extra resources that can go into their animations, their movements, their skills, their movesets, all these things they can pour into it. And all of this came together in a way where he says, a lot of these problems that they felt existed were able to be solved by actually paring down the two main characters to just Adel and Karja here in East 10. And it allowed them to actually have a level of originality as well that differentiates it from what came before.
Having gone from Monstrum Nox, which featured a 24-year-old adult, to a 17-year-old in Nordics, did you have to familiarise yourself with some of Adel's earlier exploits to get yourself back into the mindset of the younger Adel?
イース9がシリーズ最上の年齢のアドルが登場するんですけれど、一方でイース10ではまた若いアドルが出てくるんですね。そのまた若いアドルを描写することにあたって、過去シリーズをもう一回勉強しないといけなかったんでしょうか。
過去シリーズはめちゃくちゃ勉強しました。で、やっぱりイース1、2に、昔、もう本みたいなマニュアルがついてたんです。そこはアドルが、一番最初の冒険ってイステリアって言われる場所だと思うんですけど、イステリアにたどり着く前に、どういう過去をどういう経路をたどって、そこにたどり着いたのかって書いてあって、いろんな情報がそこにあったんです。例えばそのイース1のマニュアルの中に、そもそもエステリアを目指してたんじゃなくて、南に下ってきたら南側では戦争してるから、西に曲がったらしいんですよ、これ。大陸を。西に曲がって、こっちにある多島海を目指してたっていう設定があるんですね。この多島海の、途中でエステリアに使って、エステリアで冒険してた。そしたら当然やっぱりアドルって本当は多島海に行くはずだったんじゃないかっていう話なんですね。それがやっぱりオベリアン湾だったりとか、結構過去の断片的な何気ない情報が今回のイステにフィードバックされたりしています。
He says, yeah, I took a lot of time and effort into studying what was in these old games. Particularly, he said, I took a look back at the original manual that was included with East 1. He says, actually, it was a really big, thick manual that had a ton of information through it. He said, I went through reading it, and what you glean from reading that is that we know that Adel came down and he was on a journey somewhere. And we think that maybe, he could have been on the journey to Asteria. But he says that's not necessarily the case because we see that because as he's making his way down, there's a conflict happening, which makes him divert. And so he has to divert to the west. And so as he goes to the west, it seems like he was going for a place called the Tato Sea. And because he's going for the sea, he said, well, maybe that actually could be the Obelia Gulf, which is depicted in East 10. So he said, yeah, a lot of care and time went into going back and looking at what Adel was originally doing and where he was going. By focusing on what was included in this original adventure and the manual there.
Has there ever been a desire to make a East game with a much older adult, like in his 30s, 40s?
逆に、今までとまた今後は、イースの30代とか40代のアルも描きたい要望がありますでしょうか。
そうですね。やっぱり、もうちょっと年齢が上がって、大人っぽく落ち着いたアドルっていうのはチャレンジしてみたいなと思っています。で、やっぱり冒険の内容によると思うんです。若い時にしかできない冒険もあれば、逆にやっぱり年齢がいってからの冒険っていうのもあって、逆にその年齢が上がったアドルの弟子みたいなのがいるかもしれませんし、その弟子が主人公だっていうのがいいなとか、いろんなやっぱりアイディアが、アドルの年齢が上がることで出てくると思いますので、ちょっと次のイースがそうなるかわからないですけれど、そのバリエーションの一つとして十分にあり得るし、たまにやっぱりスタッフともそういう話題になったりします。
He said, yeah, there absolutely is a desire to depict an older adult. He says the thing is that there's probably things that can only be done with a certain age of the main character, whether that be a young adult or an older adult. And with adult, also, there's this desire, he says, within us to kind of, because we have it, to depict him as an older person, as a more, set adult man in that kind of environment. It says, in that situation, well, what would it be like? Maybe it would be at the point in Adol's life where he actually has a disciple who travels along with him. And so maybe actually the disciple turns out to be the main character. He says these are things that the staff has thought about over the years, and it is something that they'd like to try to do one day in a future East game. You can't say if it'll be, for example, the next East game, but it is definitely something they want to challenge themselves to do. And also, it is something that they want to do because as staff, they do want to depict Adol at a different stage of his life. and they think that would be an interesting thing to do because it would open up the doors to depict an adventure that could only be done by virtue of the fact that Adol is old.
Plus, to be fair, he'd probably be overpowered by that point. He's had some pretty big accomplishments. So since it does feature a 17-year-old adult, how back does this event of Nordics take place? Is it just after like East 1 and 2, or where is it chronologically?
今回の簡単な答えなんですけども、ミス10っていうのは、アドルのゲームの歴史の中でどこにするか
そうですね、今回はアドル17歳。もともとアドルの最初の冒険で、その1個前の17歳のエステリアの時代になります。本当にアドルが冒険を始めて、もう間もないことという話になります。
So yes, this is an adventure where, like you said, it's Adol 17, which means it's directly after his adventures in Hysteria. And so it takes place immediately after those adventures in Hysteria.
Alright. Fun question that many people have asked over the years: who would win in a sword fight between Link from The Legend of Zelda or Adol?
That's what I'd like to think. Wish I could say it's been
楽しい質問なんですけども、もし答えられるんでしたら、ゼルダ伝説の文化か、アドルの伝説か
剣の技ってことですよね。わかんないですね。どっちが強いの
？Says I have no clue. I don't know who would be stronger in that situation necessarily.
Surely it's got to be Adol. I mean, it's like one hero in all the games versus a different Link in every game.
アドルでしょう。なぜかっていうと、E シリーズはずっと同じアドルですから、リンクは毎回違う。
そういう考え方もあるんです。
So that's definitely one way to look at it, for sure.
Yeah. If Nintendo ever asked Nihon Falcom to use one of your characters in this new Smash Bros. Game, which one character would you pick?
もし Nintendo スマッシュブラに、日本ファルコンさんのキャラクター入れたいって言われたら、誰をおすすめしますか？
でもやっぱりアドルじゃないですか。奇跡シリーズは主人公が変わっちゃいますけど、やっぱりアドルは歴史も長いし、知ってる方もたくさんいますし、なんか奇跡シリーズはやっぱりファルコンを代表するキャラクターだとすると、バンって言われるとちょっとなんかピンとこない。やっぱり長年主人公を務めてるのはアドルであってほしいな、個人的には。
Personally, definitely want to be Adol. I mean, Adol, in comparison to other characters that are part of this, the lineup of Nihon Falcom, Adol has been the main character for many different games. He's been around for a long time. Unlike the Trails series, where every arc the main character changes, Adol has been this consistent presence that probably a lot of people know, and he's a very recognizable character. So even, for example, if you were to think about, well, the recent Trails game would have began, he's like, I don't necessarily understand to be a good fit for those reasons. So he says, personally, I would love if asked, if Adol would be included in the game.
With Yeast 5 yet to be localized in the West, could you ever see a remake happening at some point and a possible Western release down the line?
Yeast 5 は、
そうでしたっけ？そうなんです。
で、今後は、Yeast 5のリメイクとしてあるんですけど、もしリメイクするんだとしても、報道では出るんでしょう。
Yeast 5のリメイクって毎回検討に上がるんです。8の時も、8と5どっちやる？9の時も9と5どっちやるって、10の時も10と5どっちやるって言って、スタッフが割と最新作やりたいなかなか実現できないところまで来てたりします。ただやっぱり日本国内でも5遊びたいなっていう意見もやっぱりありますし、今回も今10を持ってまた悩んでるんです。5をやるか11をやるか。
So we've always been thinking about remaking this. He said, actually, every single time we make a new East game, the topic comes up. We were making East 8. Should we make East 8 or East 5? Or remake East 5? 9. Should we make East 9 or should we remake East 5? 10, the same thing. Make East 10, remake East 5. And he says the thing is that generally speaking, the staff themselves want to work on a brand new East title rather than remake, so it usually ends up this way. But he said even in Japan, we know that lots of players would love to play a remake of the game, so it is something that's definitely in their mind that they will continue to agonize over every time a new one comes. They make a new game.
もし実現できれば、5も実現できれば、11でもそうなんですけれど、 だからこれだけ遊んでもらえるようになっているのも、もちろん上でも、はい、リリースできればと思っています。
So yes, and if we were to realize an Ys 5 remake, or if Ys 11 comes out first, we know that there's lots of fans who love the Ys series out in the West, and of course we want to bring it to you.
Given that it's been 14 years since the release of Ys vs Trails in the Sky Alternative Saga, could you ever see yourselves going back to this idea with another game?
Ys、PSP の Ys がそれの奇跡っていうのだったんですけれども、また将来は自分のゲームを作ることが可能でしょうか。
これは社内でもやらないんですかって実はよく言われるので、本当に機会があればまた、奇跡シリーズのキャラクターがいっぱい、あれから増えてますし、イスシリーズもね、人気キャラクターが出てるので、そういったキャラクターたちを対戦するようなゲームを作りたいなと思ってます。まあ、なかなかちょっと、シリーズものが続いてるので、チャンスがあれば、ぜひ、また、はい、バーサスやりたいなと思います。
Can you ask the guy in the black, the tall black guy? Because, yeah, I actually, even staff members within the company have said, we should really try this again. This would be really good to do. So we said there is a desire even from the company itself to do this. And it would be great to do because obviously the rosters for both titles have greatly increased. You've got a ton of new characters that have come out in the Trail series since that game originally came out. And there's been tons of characters that have come out in Ys as well. So the thing is that he says we are focused on kind of our main series at the moment, but if there is an opportunity someday to do that again, it would be something they would love to challenge themselves to do.
So next one should be, given that you gave a lot of high praise to the Ys 8 novelization, have there been any more desire or conversation to do novelizations for any other Ys games, such as 9 and 10?
Ys 8の能力が結構
北米で。
はい。北米でもそうなんですが、御社の評価も高かったようなんですね。で、ファルコンさんとしては、例えば Ys 9または Ys 10の能力ができるという機会があったら、それは実現したいと思います。
もうまず本すごくかっこよくて、僕も実際に見てるんですよ。で、英語を、読めないなりにちょっと読ませていただいたら、割とダーマの心情とか、ゲームでは描いてなかったところで彼として、僕らとしてもすごく新鮮で、楽しみにしています。当然やっぱり9とか10の機会があれば、ぜひ実現してほしいなというふうに思っています。
He says, yeah, actually, he says, as somebody who wouldn't really call myself an English reader, he said I did do my best to kind of make my way through as much of the book as I can. And he said, first of all, I thought the book was really cool. The look of it was, a good volume. He said, but also what I really appreciated about it was the parts that I could understand. I really appreciated how, Donna's inner self was depicted and how a lot of the things that obviously couldn't be portrayed in the game were able to come out in the book. And so I really appreciated that aspect of it. And so absolutely, if there was an opportunity to have a novelization of 9 or 10, I would love for that to happen.
When not running Nihon Falcom and working on new games, do you get much spare time yourself for gaming? And have you had the chance to play recent Final Fantasy or Xenoblade Chronicles games?
社長が多分朝食ですごく忙しいかと思うんですけれども、自分のプライベートタイムができるときは、ゲーム、例えば最近のゼノブレード、またはファイナルファンタジーをやりますか？
そうですね。なかなかちょっとゲームを遊ぶ機会が最近ないんですけれど、ゼノブレードはちょっとプレイしてないですけど、ファイナルファンタジーをたまにプレイしてたりすることがあります。
Says, you're right, I don't have a lot of time to play games nowadays. Says, but recently, when I have, he said, no, I haven't played the Xenoblade games, but he said I have played some of the more recent Final Fantasy.
あとは大体アトラスさんの新作に遊んでますかね。
So also, I generally do play the new Atlas games when they come out as well.
That's always a win. Thanks to your partnership with Nice America, you guys have been great supporters of the Nintendo Switch system. Can we expect to see that partnership continue with whatever Nintendo do next?
ニュースアメリカのと、本社のタイトルはスイッチで出てて、本社の自分もこれから自分でスイッチ版を作ってるんですけれども、ニンテンドーさんの、これから出てくるでしょう、人気、新規ハードも、サポートする予定でしょうか？
もちろん、やれるようになったらトライしてみたいというふうに思ってます。
Yes, absolutely. If there's the opportunity for us to be able to, create something for whatever Nintendo has for the future, we would love to be able to participate.
Lovely. And final question, is there anything you'd like to say or do you have any additional comments you'd like to add for our readers and fans who love your series?
最後なんですけど、メッセージが
そうですね、欧米で僕らのタイトルって、本当に、コンソール始めた頃にはまだまだちょっとプレイしてもらえる機会が少なくて、でもここ数年、やっぱりニーサさんにこう定期的にきちんとリリースしていただいて、だいぶプレイしてくれる方々が増えてきたなっていう手応えがすごくあるんですね。で、開発の方でも、今までは、欧米とか、アジアも含めて海外のことってあまりやっぱり意識はなかったんですけど、ちょっとずつやっぱりそういう人たちに向けてこういうことやったらどうなのかとか、それからやっぱり英語版作るとしたら、ちょっとでも作業しやすいように、開発環境を変えていこうよっていう話が出てきていて、本当にゲームの作り方も僕ら変わってきたんですね。で、今後、やっぱり、ゲームの販売の比率も、エリアごとの比率も、特に欧米伸びてきてますので、僕らのタイトル、一通りきちんと欧米でリリースできるように努力していきたいと思いますので、ぜひ皆さんに遊んでいただければなと思います。
You know, in the past, I don't necessarily know that Western fans had a great opportunity to play many of our titles, but I feel more in recent years, thanks to partners like NIS America, we've been able to bring out the games on a regular basis, and more people have begun to play our games, and it seems like they really like them. And I know that for us, not only in the West, but a lot of other areas of the world, a lot of our games are getting more and more popular, and so we're able to see our games enjoyed by a broader audience. And we as developers have now started to think more about our audience outside of Japan. And we begin to, as we make our games, to think what our audiences in these other places in the West, for example, take certain elements of these games. And so we've thought about them and added them into our thought process when it comes to game design and game development. And we've also, on the development side, have made it a little bit easier for our partners to localize the games into English. And so this is something that I have really built for the company to be able to, on both fronts, bringing the games to the fans and thinking about those fans when we're making the games, as well as having the games localized and being in an environment that's easier to localize. These are things that we've put a lot of work into. And so what I would ask of our fans in the West is that please continue to play and enjoy our games, and we'll keep making them for you.
Well, like with all good things that must come to an end, so must this podcast. So thank you, Mr. Toshihiro Kondo, and to you, Alan, as well, for interpreting for us, and to everybody at home as well who has been watching and listening to this podcast. We do very, very much appreciate you guys for taking the time to tune in to us, and we hope that you will continue to do so in the near future and help us continue to improve and get better and better. So until next time, everyone, keep on gaming.